Morning, everyone. Just so you know, I'm setting up the TikTok stream right now. See if we can get that going. I have a feeling like my TikTok app on my phone is going to crash today. It just seems to be chugging along pretty slowly. I assume that means that it's not handling the task very well. But let's see how far we get. Welcome to everybody who's joining. We have a special episode today, a special live study. We're going to be jumping over some different academic, scholarly views and theories. Patronizing Saint, welcome, says, I can't get YouTube on my desktop, so I'm using my phone. For some reason, YouTube keeps refusing to load. Give it a couple minutes because I'm using a service that streams to multiple places at the same time. And I think what happens is that sometimes one service kind of delays and another one is quicker. So it might work later. Unworthy servant, good morning. Thank you for the exclamation marks. That's high energy right away. Today we have an interesting batch of topics. Basically, there's two main things I want to look at. One of them is a character called Martin Noth, and another one is a scholar called George Mendenhall. You probably have never heard of either of those guys, and guess what? Neither did I until I was doing research for the book that I'm writing. And now that I know about them, I want to know a little bit more. So instead of doing it on my own time, I'm going to do it. I mean, this is my own time, but instead of doing it just away from the stream, why not do exactly what this is for? It's a live study. I can study this at the same time that I'm talking with you guys. And so you get to join me as I'm studying George Mendenhall and Martin Noth. God love, welcome to the stream. Just so you guys know, if you're just joining me, I am the author of two books. Maybe Everyone is Wrong, Revelations, Conspiracy in the Kingdom of Heaven, and Fire in the Rabbit Hole, which is about New Age mysticism and the modern deceptions that are trying to take down Christianity by providing secret hidden truths to Christians on the internet. All these different rabbit holes people are going down that lead them away from the Bible and away from Christianity. And that's my link tree right here, if that works, so that you can look up all the different things I do. In fact, I just published a new article. Maybe that's something else we should do. Would you guys like to see another article that I wrote yesterday about Donald Trump? I think it's a pretty good one. I didn't even think about that, but I wrote an article about Donald Trump yesterday, and I could read that for you guys if you're interested. Stapleton, good morning. Unworthy servant sent some roses, I suppose, on TikTok. That is nice. Thank you. Unworthy servant says, I used to think you were a universalist when I heard the title, Maybe Everyone is Wrong. I can see why. I think that's one of the reasons why I got kind of a boost when I was promoting the book, is because it appealed to people who are universalists. All right, Baoli says we should read the article, so I'm going to try to find the fastest way to read the article. Let's see if I can. Here we go. All right. You guys are probably going to enjoy this one, right? I don't know how big of a Trump fans we have in the audience, but strap in. Here's what it's called. By the way, my Substack is called winterchristian.substack.com. The proper title of it is The Winter Christian. Dan says, Trump fan here, can't wait to hear. Good. The winterchristian.substack.com. If you see this graphic glitching around, it's because TikTok is trying to find my palm of my hand, and when my hands aren't on the screen, it just randomly throws it around in my face, so don't get too distracted by that. Over on YouTube, I actually have the article pulled up on the screen so you can see the visual and the pictures that I put in there, the tweets that I put in there. I have links to a bunch of stuff in the article. Here on TikTok, you guys I can't share it with you, so you're going to have to just follow along. I'm not happy with my hair. Oh, well. Let's just get started. The title of the article is Donald Lockdown Trump is begging the deep state to let him finish the job. Subtitle: With DeSantis taking the lead, will the Pentagon allow Trump to complete his mission of destroying America and rebuilding it from the ashes, or is he being disposed of? So that's the title. Donald Lockdown Trump is begging the deep state to let him finish the job. Then I start off most of my articles with in case you missed it, and then I have some data just to make sure that you quickly understand where things are standing in case you haven't been paying attention. So the first thing I say is in case you missed it, and then I have a tweet about Donald Trump filing the official forms to run for president for the United States in 2024. So you can see the Federal Election Commission form that he filled out. It was posted November 16th. That is yesterday. And so officially, Trump has filed the forms necessary to run for president in 2024. Second tweet is about a video from New York City outside of Trump Tower of MAGA supporters gathering outside Trump Tower in Manhattan chanting USA while stomping on DeSantis campaign posters saying Trump or death and telling Nancy Pelosi there's no ice cream in hell before accusing her husband of being a cruiser. Not a cult, though. Absolutely not. That is from Amity Resists on Twitter. That was posted November 15th, so that's 2 days ago. Let me just make sure I have the chat properly on the screen here. Crazy says, what's your thoughts on schools providing litter boxes to kids identifying as furries? I don't know if that's true, so I'm not going to comment on it. Bigfoot Tracker says, I like Trump. Well, you're going to love this article then, I think. Here's the third one from a MAGA Twitter account. It says, special request, please unfollow me if you're stabbing this man in the back, with a picture of Donald Trump, and instead support the flavor of the moment, Ron DeSantis, an establishment puppet with zero national experience. I can't stand traitors, especially stupid ones. And the picture says, he had everything. He chose us. And so that's another example of these MAGA supporters getting a little bit nervous about Ron DeSantis becoming popular. That was posted November 10th, so 7 days ago. Then I say 2024 GOP election tensions are already underway as mainstream Republican support massively swings in favor of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. due to his successful anti-lockdown, anti-mandate policies. And then I have a link to a Breitbart article that says, let me just open it up here. Poll, GOP supports shift to Ron DeSantis over Donald Trump by 7 points. So 7 percentage points. Ron DeSantis is leading above Trump. And then there's another one from ABC.net. The once Donald Trump's closest ally, now his biggest threat, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has his eyes on 2024. Another talking point to get you up to speed. It says, even Alex Jones has endorsed Ron DeSantis multiple times. You guys know Alex Jones. However, the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago gave Trump a boost, and Jones has wobbled on his stance. So there's a video from the Young Turks. I do not like the Young Turks, just to be clear, but they did do a video nicely showing how Alex Jones was supporting Ron DeSantis, and then afterwards he flipped and he started sending messages to Trump and asking Trump to reconsider certain policies, and he wants to have Trump run. He's basically apologizing for endorsing Ron DeSantis, and so they're making fun of him in that video, but I just wanted to have the clips there and available, and they had the clips available. Then I say, according to the Daily Beast's sources, which I found via revolver.news, Trump is, quote, ready for war and willing to, quote, burn it all down if he is not nominated as the GOP candidate for the 2024 election. What does it mean to be ready for war and to burn it all down? That's one of the interesting things that we got to look at. Also, finally, Trump is pitching the idea of executing drug dealers if he is elected again. And then there's a tweet from Breaking 911 where Trump calls for the execution of drug dealers. And there's a video clip that's a minute long where Trump says, we're going to be asking everyone who sells drugs, gets caught selling drugs, to receive the death penalty for their heinous acts because it's the only way. I don't even know if the American public is ready for it. So that's that's from yesterday, Trump saying he would like to execute drug dealers if he becomes president again. Let's see, I'm getting some comments already. Shalom, John, 316. Patronizing Saint says, I think he's a psychopath. Sorry. God Love says, you are right, Patronizing Saint. And I don't understand Christian idolatry of this man. Let's see what I missed here. That was just the introduction of the article. Stapleton says, love the title. Stapleton says, that ice cream comment, priceless. Nor says, I'm not a fan of his personality, but his policies were the best. And Unworthy Servant says, I don't think Trump fans realize where you're going with this. And then a big smile. KB Nusa says, DeSantis is being used by the establishment. Dan says, love Trump, but DeSantis is the future also. But they need to find a way to coexist. Bigfoot Tracker says, I think all humans are corrupt, and the Antichrist will show this and thus bring forth transhumanism. Okay. So I think we can get started. Now, here I have, just because that's the background, right? DeSantis is becoming popular. Trump voters don't like it. Trump internally, there's a leaked memo or a leaked rumor that Trump is going to be very angry if DeSantis gets the nomination. He wants to be the 2024 Republican nominee. And so obviously he thinks he got screwed out of the election. And so this whole thing is, creating tension. And so the Republican Party is being divided. I have a picture here of Trump standing in the briefing room in the White House next to Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci. And Anthony Fauci is glaring at Donald Trump. And my caption is, Anthony Fauci menacingly glares at his subservient dog. Donald Trump. Heading, long time in the making. So this section is called Long Time in the Making. I have a theory about why Trump went along with the pandemic narrative. It begins with his suspicious rise to prominence and ends with a series of legendary betrayals that almost make me feel sorry for him. Trump has been groomed for presidency since he was young. How young, I won't surmise. Much of his life has been a stage play, grabbing headlines and staying in the public consciousness as Teflon Don, because accusations, lawsuits, and controversies surround him, but nothing sticks to him. In the real world, only evil people are Teflon. The rest of us get screwed. Already in the 1980s, political insiders and celebrities saw the pattern and openly batted around the idea of Trump seeking to be the mayor of New York City, or the governor of the state, or even the president of the USA. Oprah Winfrey asked him about it in 1988. And then there's a clip I have here from Trump doing an interview on Oprah Winfrey's show where she asks him about running for president, and he basically says someday he would be willing to consider it. The next section is called Waiting for the Storm. I said Trump knew he was a sleeper agent for the deep state, i.e. Pentagon. But he didn't know what that would entail when he ran for president. He made a deal with the devil to become the commander-in-chief so that he could make America great again. But there was a catch. This is my theory. He would have to faithfully obey the military during a massive transformation initiated by them. In Trump's mind, he probably assumed this would be World War III, or a QAnon-style blitz against corrupt insiders, pedophile blackmail rings, the locking up of Hillary Clinton, and the release of top-secret technologies that would launch America to new heights. This is why, despite claiming to be the biggest war hawk in the world during his election debates, he completely avoided starting new wars during his presidency and pushed instead for accountability of Obama and the quote-unquote swamp. He genuinely wanted that to happen. He launched a feint assault against Syria for the media, which pacified even Hillary Clinton and John McCain, who hailed him as a true president when he did it. And he destroyed the caliphate of ISIS and deftly won over North Korea. And I have links to various news stories related to that, where Hillary Clinton agrees with Trump launching missiles into Syria, the media praising Trump for launching missiles into Syria. Here's a video of John McCain saying that President Trump has become a truly presidential and respectable man now that he has attacked Syria, but he has to do even more. So you can see that Trump didn't actually do a bunch of... I'm reading from my own article, J.A. I wrote an article called Donald Lockdown Trump is begging the deep state to let him finish the job. So John McCain even was impressed by Trump when he launched missiles into Syria, but it turns out apparently Trump just told the Syrians to move their planes out of the way so that no actual damage would be done. And so the media got all hyped up about it, and John McCain and Hillary Clinton suddenly loved Donald Trump, but turns out no actual damage was done, so they all just looked like idiots afterwards. And I was very impressed by that move. That's a very clever thing that Trump did, right? Here's the next section, Storm of Lies. However, the storm Trump was waiting to deal with did not come in the form of either foreign war or a Washington purge. It was a psychological operation, a live exercise, as the CIA director turned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it. And I have a link to a C-SPAN video where Mike Pompeo said on TV that the pandemic was a live exercise. And of course, he was the former CIA director. So, I said, you know about Event 201, and then I have a link to, obviously, Event 201 stuff. I said, President Donald J. Trump ignored the pleas of civil liberties advocates, Republican donors, economics professors, parents, workers, teachers, epidemiologists, the Constitution, and common sense in order to obey the whims of Anthony Fauci and Bill Gates, shutting down America's economy and printing trillions of dollars to bail out Fortune 500 companies while small businesses were annihilated, creating one of the largest bottom-to-top transfers of wealth in history and guaranteeing crippling hyperinflation. And by the way, I do think the hyperinflation we're seeing now is because of Donald Trump's lockdowns, because he printed trillions of dollars for that. He did this because he thought it was all building up to a radical restructuring of the world, with the U.S. military taking charge of the global economy and society, giving orders to corporations and health institutions, i.e. fascism, and with himself as the commander-in-chief. And in case you didn't know, when the military runs corporations and all the public institutions, that's called fascism. So that's why it's actually fair to say that Trump was pretty much a fascist, or he wanted to be a fascist. Let me read some comments here again. Patronizing Saint says it's a big meeting for conservatives, and yes, they literally rolled a gold statue of him in at CPAC. I think you guys, yeah, it's CPAC, CPAC. That's the conservative convention. Patronizing Saint says, I hate the woke culture. Don't get me wrong, but I don't believe that the ends always justify the means. So I think to myself, maybe this guy will get rid of the woke, but I don't ignore the actions he takes that are wicked. Looks like people are talking about weird numerology things of certain times being 666 days apart. Jay Thompson, welcome. We're reading from an article that I wrote about Donald Trump and how he's desperate to become president again. And the question is why? What is he planning? Now, next section is called Warped Priorities. I said not only that, but Trump authorized Operation Warp Speed to empower the U.S. military to develop the experimental vaccines now plaguing mankind. These were coercively forced onto American soldiers, citizens, and workers around the world in accordance with the Pentagon Pharma conspiracy. Trump repeatedly insisted that his voters get the vaccines, even as his popularity took a beating. He called himself the father of the vaccines and bragged about being responsible for hasty, untested infections. And I have a link to an article that documents that. He broke all precedent by holding daily media briefings, regurgitating the talking points given to him by Fauci, Birx, and Gates, lying to the public and justifying the destruction of America. Why? He desperately wanted to show his submission to the Department of Defense and their scheme, giving them no resistance. He was intent on holding his end of the deal. Trump believed his betrayal of the country would be rewarded with a second term, where he would have his turn to revolutionize the nation. Next section is called Dealing with the Devil. I say, consider this quote from his 1987 bestseller book, The Art of the Deal. And then I have a picture of the cover of his book, The Art of the Deal. Here's the quote from his own book. He says, "I don't do it for the money. I've got enough, much more than I'll ever need. Deals are my art form. Other people paint beautifully on canvas or write wonderful poetry. I like making deals, preferably big deals. That's how I get my kicks." That's the end of the quote from the book. I said, there is no bigger deal that could be made than agreeing to be the president of the USA during its planned collapse and restructuring. Trump believed he was destined for this position, and his handlers convinced him that going along with the pandemic psyop would be enough to fulfill his end of the bargain. He was duped. Trump wanted to win so badly he couldn't accept that he was stabbed in the back with the 2020 election fraud. He started to fight back against it and demand to be upheld as the rightful president, thinking he could marshal some kind of military support. He probably even believed that the steal would be allowed to proceed just long enough to expose the culprits so that the military could crack down on the swamp. But he still didn't get it. His unsightly whining only earned him a second impeachment, and he was kicked out of the White House with more than a few daggers in his back. Last section. Can Trump finish the deal? I said, now here's the funny part. No matter how betrayed Trump feels, he will never get a second term as president if he goes against the military, and he knows it. He has to play along, and they are happy to feed him disinformation. My theory is that Trump is the biggest mark in history. He believes the QAnon propaganda himself. He probably gets national security briefings and advanced intel about what's going to happen so that he feels like he is part of their plan still. They're probably telling him that Joe Biden is not the real president and that this is all just another phase of the storm. Trump is supposed to patiently sit by and await his chance to come back and save America. The night must become darkest before the dawn, right? In this sense, Trump is the perfect puppet. Totally powerless, endlessly eager, too proud to admit he's a pawn, waiting for his chance to do something great. That's why he can't afford a rival in the GOP, and especially not one whose popularity capitalizes on the giant crime against humanity Trump perpetrated in office. Ron DeSantis clearly mimics Trump's style, hand gestures, and attitude about America, but as governor, he proved himself to be against the biosecurity state and medical tyranny more than anyone else. How can Trump fight against that? I believe the deep state is weighing their options right now. Ironically, Trump's numbers go up the more persecuted he is, so he may have to endure a few years of humiliation and attack just to stay in the fight, while DeSantis gets to be a squeaky clean hero, winning over the real voters. I don't want Donald Lockdown Trump to come back into power. The father of the vaccine can rot in prison for all I care, preferably right next to Fauci and Gates. MAGA Republicans may not be ready to accept that Trump is the one responsible for all the damage now blamed on Biden, but it's the reality. Maybe Biden is being used to absorb all the hate Trump deserves, so that he can make his 2024 run seeming like the good guy. Maybe people will wake up and realize he's the bad guy. And that's the end of the article. So there you go. Unworthy Servant says the Middle East peace deal would be the biggest deal he could imagine. Well, I guess so, but it didn't really lead to much, I don't think. Whereas destroying America was a pretty big deal. Jordan Hacker says, loved your podcast. Trish says, if you still think politics matter, you are walking around blind. I don't know if you mean elections or just, politics in general, but politics do matter. It's just they're rigged. Unworthy Servant says, the Middle East... oh, yeah, you already read that. Unworthy Servant says, I wonder how he will eventually take DeSantis out of the way. Ravi has a question. Go ahead, Ravi. Ask a question. Shadow Raid says, I have no faith in the current political system. Either side is corrupt. Ravi asks or says, could the Antichrist not know that he is the Antichrist and do all the things foretold under the guise he is doing good? I believe so. I don't think that the Antichrist would have to know that he's the Antichrist. Remember, Satan's servants are the most deceived of all. They're the ones that are tricked the most. If you're serving Satan, you don't get it. You don't actually understand what you're doing. That's the reason why you serve Satan, is because you don't realize you're serving Satan. So Satan doesn't tell the full plan to his own servants. Otherwise, they could just say, hey, we lose in the end. Why are we doing this? They have to think that they're going to win. They have to think they're doing good. They have to be motivated, and so on. All right, that wasn't the focus of today's study, although it did take up 30 minutes. If you like that, you can go to winterchristian.substack.com and leave a comment or like it. Also, if you sign up to my Substack, you get emailed the articles, so you don't even have to go back to the website. You just have to sign up once, give your email there, and then you get a direct email from me or from my Substack to your email account, because that way you don't have to go back to the website and revisit it and check the articles. You'll just get notified in your emails. Okay. We are not doing a Corinthian study today. We are doing a scholarship study today. I want to look up a certain guy named Mendenhall and Noth, who was a German Bible scholar during World War II. And then, if I have time, I'm getting too warm here. If I have time, I will read some in this book, The 10th Generation, by George Mendenhall. I want to do some actual studying that I myself need to do for the book that I'm writing, and so I'm going to do some of it here. Patronizing Saint says, I guess you can't get more of an ego boost than getting the devil's attention. Well, he'll certainly try to make you feel like you're a big shot if you're serving him. Bailey says, so Biden was made a clown on purpose for everyone to see, perhaps to bring down the old way and bring in the woke. There's a lot of reasons, I suspect, but they're setting up the collapse of America, and so they need various people in charge who are either so incompetent that you can blame this incompetent old guy for why everything's falling apart, or somebody really woke, or Trump making America great again, but actually doing all these things that destroys America. Anyway, Mendenhall and Noth. Here's what it says on the jewishvirtuallibrary.org. Born in 1902 to 1968. Just so you guys know, this is the guy who came up with a certain theory about how the Bible was written. He had a theory that the Bible was written by Jews during the Babylonian exile, that it wasn't written by Moses or somebody older. He said that it must have been written by Jews in Babylon to try to explain their history by writing this big backstory for how they got to Babylon. So it says he's a German Bible scholar, a disciple of Albrecht Alt, to whose ideas Noth was deeply indebted. Albrecht Alt. Let's look that up quickly. Albrecht Alt was a leading German Protestant theologian. He wrote a bunch of books. Looks like he died in 1956. It's always weird to think of scholars working in Nazi Germany, but not necessarily having a Nazi affiliation, right? So, I don't know if this guy was. It doesn't say that he had any. I don't believe it says he has any Nazi affiliation. Noth was born in Dresden and served as a professor of Königsberg and Bonn. He edited Zeitschrift des Deutschen Palästina Vereins from 1929 to 1964 and was the director of Deutsche Evangelisch Institute in Jerusalem from 1965 until his death. Noth brought his extensive topographical studies, mainly published in a certain whatever publication, linguistic research, and form criticism studies to bear on problems of Israelite history. Of primary importance was his thesis that from the time of the settlement, Israel was organized into a 12-tribe confederation, similar to the Greek, oh man, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that word, Amphictyony. He felt that virtually nothing can be known about pre-settlement history. Noth was one of the foremost representatives of the form-critical approach, and his studies of Pentateuchal traditions and Deuteronomy had widespread influence on biblical research. In the former work, he examined the themes of the Pentateuchal narrative and the history of the traditions, and presented the idea that both J and E go back to a common source, G. Man, I don't know what they're talking about there. Is that Yahwist and Elohist? Because I know there's a theory that there's two different groups of Jews in the Bible who basically are confused with each other. One worships Yahweh and the other worships Elohim or El. I think that's probably what it's talking about. In the latter, he originated the idea of the Deuteronomic history work, a unified history extending from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, in which previously independent units were joined and unified by a distinctive theology and philosophy of history. So that's the idea that the Bible is not written from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Judges, and so Deuteronomy, Judges, and so on. The theory is that nothing was really written until much later, hundreds and hundreds of years later, when they basically created the whole mythology of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, at one point, at the same time. Or I guess in this case, he's actually saying that it goes from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings, and that what's before that is even more fictional and untrustworthy. But Deuteronomy all the way to 2 Kings was basically a fake story to try to explain how they ended up in Babylon. So that was a theory come up with by Martin Noth, and he's a very prominent scholar, and a lot of people believe in this Deuteronomic history theory. It says he linked Hebrew law to the religious confederation rather than to the monarchy. He wrote commentaries to individual books of the Bible, and he wrote the history of Israel and a bunch of other books. Some of his articles were collected in his other book. Okay, so that's not a very useful article. I was actually hoping for something better than that. Wikipedia says he was a German scholar of the Hebrew Bible who specialized in pre-exile history of the Hebrews and promoted the hypothesis that the Israelite tribes in the immediate period after the settlement in Canaan were organized as a group of 12 tribes arranged around a central sanctuary on the lines of the later Greek-Italian merging, I guess you could call it. He pioneered the traditional historical approach to biblical studies, emphasizing the role of oral traditions in the formation of the biblical texts. He wrote an essay in 1930 called The Scheme of the 12 Tribes of Israel, which doesn't sound very nice, but no one is saying that he was a Nazi or an anti-Semite, so that's interesting. Yeah, nobody seems to be accusing him of anti-Semitism, even though he's undermining all of this biblical history about the Jews. Britannica.com says, Noth proposed the theory that the unity called Israel did not exist prior to the covenant assembly at Shechem in Canaan, which is found in Joshua 24. So let's go look up Joshua 24. The last chapter of Joshua. It says, Joshua gathered all the 12 tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel. And they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to the people, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan, and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. And I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and afterward I brought you out. And so then it goes on to explain bringing the Jews out of Egypt through the Red Sea, some miracles. They crossed the side of Jordan. They had to fight the Amorites and various kings of Moab. And so the idea is that this is the actual origin story of the Jews, of Israel, is that these were just different tribes, and Joshua basically united them with a backstory that he created here. And then later on, I guess somebody went and wrote Genesis and Exodus and stuff. And it goes on to tell them that they have to choose if they will still serve the Lord or and then the people choose to serve the Lord instead of other gods. And Joshua says the Lord will not forgive them, or they will not be able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord or serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you. So you can see it's a radical theory, right? This is a radical theory of how the Bible is essentially not true, but it is based on true events. And so I'm interested in looking this kind of thing up right now because I'm doing a whole book about, how difficult it is to say that you believe the Bible and what that means to believe the Bible. People are talking about, the idea of you don't have to worry about the whole Jehovah Elohim distinction. That's not important for what we're looking up here. There's just the fact that sometimes different things are called different things. I think Michael Heiser kind of sorted that out himself by saying that Elohim is just a title for every kind of divine being, but that God is the Elohim of Elohim. He is the God of gods. He is God wouldn't even be the right term there. He is the ultimate head of all spiritual beings, the ruler, the creator of them all. And so other things are called Elohim sometimes, and El and whatever, but he's the most high God. He's the almighty God. He's the creator of all other Elohim. And meanwhile, Yahweh or Jehovah is a personal title that he kind of gave himself, although even that is just a statement of, I am that I am, or whatever, that it's not like a given name. It's just the name that he gave himself for the sake of their understanding or whatever. So scholars argue about these things. It's not really important here. It says, regarding Martin Noth's theory, it says, in his view, the tribes theretofore loosely related through customs and traditions accepted the worship and the covenant of Yahweh imposed by Joshua. Oral traditions from the various tribes were combined in the Pentateuch after the covenant union. Oh, okay, so that's the theory. And it was only at the time of Ezra that the traditions were finally written down, often combining different narrative elements into a single tale. Wow, that's an extreme take. Thus, the story of Passover and that of the Exodus, once separate traditions, were linked in the written books of Moses. The two major narrative traditions, the Jehovistic and Elohistic, so there it mentions it directly. The two major narrative traditions, the Jehovistic and Elohistic, so called from the name used for God in each, formed a framework around the other traditional elements. Okay, so that actually helps a lot. That helps me understand what this guy's theory actually was. I thought for sure that he was going to be accused of being a Nazi, and because he was a German soldier during World War II, and I thought he'd be called an anti-Semite and that this would be a controversial point of view, but apparently everyone is cool with that. No one's accusing him of anything, even though he wrote something called The Scheme of the 12 Tribes of Israel. So that's kind of weird. But these are the kinds of theories that I'm looking up. Yeah, John 3:16 says, "The great I am, I am." Unworthy Servant says, Michael Heiser, Unseen Realms, and Bible Project go too far with their divine counsel. Dangerous. Excuse me. I tend to agree with you. I think they bring up a lot of interesting material and a bunch of interesting points. But at the same time, I don't think that the Bible fully captures what's going on in the spiritual world. I think that it gives you glimpses of it, but that it is open to interpretation what's really going on. I would say it's not our place to know all the secrets of what goes on in the spiritual realm, but that we are free to use the text and logic to try to figure it out, as long as we don't become dogmatic about it and try to pretend like we figured it all out. Like, I have my own theory that's not the same as Michael Heiser's, and I'm going to flesh that out in the book that I'm writing. So it is easy to go too far when you're speculating, but I do think that Michael Heiser himself, when you really actually read his stuff, he tends to clarify that this is his theory. It's based on such and such texts. He has his own method for how he reached those conclusions. So I don't feel like he's really being offensive, because he's not pretending like, I got a revelation from God and I am telling you how the divine counsel of God works. But there are very important and interesting scenes in the Bible that allude to there being a divine counsel where God is listening to his angels and they're giving him different advice, and it explains a lot of weird things in the Old Testament. Okay, so that's Martin Noth. I actually feel like I need to write or copy and paste a section of this Britannica article so that I can easily reference it in the future. Let's see if I can I'm just going to copy this. Because this is going to be interesting to reference later. Okay. Now, I think that's about all that I needed to know about Martin Noth. So the next thing would be, if you guys are interested, and I guess even if you're not, because I'm interested, I want to do some reading from this book that I bought. I bought it used because it's really hard to find and it's very expensive new, called The 10th Generation by George E. Mendenhall. George Mendenhall was a Lutheran? What was he? He was some sort of preacher in America in the 50s and 60s, I think. And then he became, basically he was a very respected expert of language, ancient languages, and ancient practices. Godlove says, "Why do you ask, Terry Wolf?" Yeah, there's no point in asking, because I'm just going to read it anyway. So this guy's theory is not that different from Martin Noth's theory. That's the connection here, is that they both have extreme takes on how the Bible came into existence. They don't believe that it's just Moses wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible, and then, the various prophets wrote down Samuel and Chronicles and Kings and stuff. So they both have their own... Oh, I lost my place. That's cool. They both have their own theories. I've already read a bunch of this book, but now I'm going to just continue from where I was. And there's a lot of interesting ideas in here already. All right, I've read that. If I could generalize what Mendenhall has said so far in this book, he is arguing that there was really a Moses, that he did kill somebody in Egypt, and he escaped as a fugitive from Egypt with a bunch of people, but that there was no plagues, there was no miracles, there was no Passover, there weren't 12 tribes, they didn't have a common ancestor, Abraham didn't really exist. It was just started with Moses, who was a fugitive for killing somebody in Egypt and taking a bunch of people with him as he fled as a fugitive from Egypt. And probably nobody chased him. The king didn't chase him. He basically says all of that is fiction. And then when they got to Sinai, then Moses created this fake covenant claiming that, God had spoken to him and whatever. And in one of his essays that I read before reading this book, I don't know if this book is going to say it, but in one of his other essays, Mendenhall says that there was just a thunderstorm at Sinai, and Moses pretended that the thunderstorm that was happening was God speaking, and so he rewrote all of the... Anyway, so he's that kind of guy. So why, you might ask, why am I even reading something like this? The reason why I want to read this is because I don't want to falsely accuse Mendenhall when I start to talk about his material in my book, because I want to reference what he says and criticize what he says, but it's a very nuanced argument that he's making, and so I don't want to put words in his mouth. So I actually have to read it in order to be able to fairly criticize him and not just put words in his mouth. And along the way, he is bringing up interesting points that are worth considering. Okay. Now, here's where we'll start. Page 27. I think this is still maybe this is the second chapter. It says, furthermore, individuals probably did not characteristically identify themselves with the tribe to which their village was assigned. He's talking about the early days of Israel, where these different tribes have made a federation. They've agreed to be one people who serve the same God, but that the tribes didn't really matter. There was no actual bloodline. They didn't actually come from 12 fathers, so what does it matter? You just were assigned to a certain region, and that region was said to be part of a certain tribe, and you just had to put up with the fact that you were arbitrarily put into that tribe. And he's got a footnote from an older article essay that he had written on that topic. Our evidence of this fact, or our evidence of this is the fact that the names of the 12 tribes occur very rarely in narratives as gentilic designations, either of villages, lineages, or persons. What does gentilic mean? I have to look this up now. When you're reading actual scholar works, you have to suddenly have a dictionary on hand because they'll just throw a word out there. It's not even in the dictionary. Okay, let's do a Google search. Oh, it just means tribal. Why not just say tribal? Okay. So, the names of the 12 tribes occur very rarely in narratives as tribal designations, either of villages, lineages, or persons. The lineage or village was the primary unit of importance, and the tribe was a superstructure with very limited social function. The tribal name of Israelite does not even occur in biblical Hebrew. Is that true? Well, Shadow Raid, Gentile means nations, which comes later to be used as an insult to mean non-Jews, but gentilic, Collins Dictionary says gentilic means derived from a place name that depicts the residents of that place. So I guess when you have a place and you call all the people something based on that place, they're said to be gentilic. So it doesn't have actually to do with the word Gentile, apparently. Patronizing Saint says, I freaking love this stuff. Oh, good. Interesting. I'm glad that people are interested in this kind of nerdy stuff like I am. God Love says, this guy, his fan of the Most High. Oh, I don't think this guy is a fan of the Most High. Yeah, well, he was a preacher. And in his own way, I will say this. This is why I didn't want to write about him so negatively and say that he was just trying to destroy the Bible, is because he actually writes about a very interesting perspective or interpretation of the Bible where he thinks that the Sinai covenant, even though it was basically a lie, it was this very important and good revolution that that did away with all of the old tyrannies and the Pharaoh and this sort of old way of thinking and created this revolutionary new ethical way of living and all sorts of stuff like that. So in his own mind, he's trying to support the Bible. He's not trying to destroy it. But I can't tell if he even believes that there's any such thing as miracles. It doesn't really seem like he does. And that's why I have to read it, because I don't know if he's going to acknowledge even the possibility of there being miracles or God or supernatural at all in the book, or if it's all just historical coincidences and things that, he says that Jews later went and created mythology around. Desert Fox says, have you ever used Webster's 1828 dictionary? If so, did you find it useful in order to derive definition closer to the time frame of translation? No, I don't think I've ever used that dictionary. I don't think that these types of terms would have changed since then, but, because this guy's he wrote this book in like the 1970s. So modern dictionaries are going to be better than the 1820s dictionary. Shadow Raid says, Moses was just a smoke and mirrors magician, and that's okay. That's basically what he's saying, yeah. Ravi says, Wolf, doesn't the perfect chiastic structure of Scripture prove Noth and this guy wrong? I'm not familiar with the chiastic structure enough to say that, but I think what he would argue is that that's actually a better argument for it, because it shows that somebody was editing the Bible to make it chiastic, to make it so that the beginning and the end match, and then the second and the second last match, and that there's this sort of mirroring effect that always happens in the text, because he would refuse to believe that would happen naturally, right? So he's trying to find the most plausible way that this came about instead of the most miraculous way that this came about. And so he's rejecting the supernatural in favor of something just logical. And so he's trying to reconstruct the history of the Bible from the point of view that it wasn't a big hoax, it wasn't a lie per se, but it was, born out of this whole logical circumstance, and that basically modern people are doing injustice to the Bible by reading it as if it was, this perfect document that came down from God and that was never edited, and it was just perfect right from the beginning, and it's been preserved ever since, and this kind of stuff. And that's the kind of nerdy stuff that I get into in my book that I'm writing, so I need to bone up on some of the stuff that this guy's talking about, because he's a big shot and has greatly influenced a lot of interpretation that scholars use nowadays. Okay, so he's arguing that the name of the 12 tribes doesn't really occur that much in the Old Testament, and the term Israelite doesn't even occur in the biblical Hebrew. That I find very shocking, is they didn't use the term Israelite in the Hebrew text. And then he has in parentheses, except according to scholarly consensus, once as a textual corruption, and twice in a very late passage, and once in a feminine form. Okay? He's a language expert, by the way. He's an expert on like 10 different languages, Hebrew and Aramaic and ancient Mesopotamian cultures and languages and stuff. So he's a scholar. He's not writing for the average person here. So this is why these are the types of arguments he's making. He says there was no such thing as an ethnic group of Israelites in this early period. Throughout history, a feeling of ethnic identity has been the product of a very long and complex process of continuity and contiguity. And he's got a footnote. He says, according to this theory, Israel would be necessarily termed the Empire of Yahweh. The theories of service are far too simple to be useful historically, although the pattern is the same. The basis of solidarity changed as the nature of the social organization changed. What was at first a religious and ethical unity, created from a very diverse population that did not even speak the same dialect of West Semitic, gave way to an uneasy political unity that soon divided into two. So that would be the two kingdoms, I guess. Not until the political and religious institutionalism was destroyed did the basis again shift to a concept of ethnic unity long after the Babylonian exile. And that was thoroughly rejected and challenged by the reform movement we now call Christianity. So he believes that Christianity was a reform movement and that it was trying to get rid of the distortion, right? He's arguing that there was originally a very simple federation of tribes where everyone was welcome and they weren't actually related and they just worshiped God and minded their own business. And then later people came by and created a kingdom and made it political and created kings and all this stuff. And then after the Babylonian exile, it becomes ethnic and racist. And that when Jesus comes by and the Christians come by, they're actually just removing that middle period of political control over the religion and turning it back into a religious and ethical movement. That's an interesting theory. Shadow Raid says the Bible tends to rope all writings there in with the same weight and authority. It's more nuanced than that. From commandments to Paul's take on hair, it's all in there. That's true. There's poetry in there. There's lists of things that don't seem to matter to us, but might have mattered to somebody in the past. The Bible is not, organized as a bunch of equally important texts. Lemuel, how could I explain what you missed? You missed me reading an article from my Substack about Donald Trump. You missed me reading about a German scholar who tried to reinterpret the origin of the Bible, and now we're reading from a book that's basically doing the same thing. It's trying to explain the history and origin to reconstruct from a non-supernatural point of view how Israel came to exist and what it represented, from a guy named George Mendenhall, who most people have never heard of, but apparently he's very influential in biblical academia and textual criticism. He says Israel was the name of the large social organization that constituted the population ruled by Yahweh. And as the prophets all pointed out, when it ceased so to be ruled, it ceased to have legitimate grounds for corporate existence. The much praised concern of the prophets for social justice stems from the fact that the transition from a religious community to a political power structure had eroded away all the old religious ethics in favor of being like all the rest of the nations, obsessed with power, concentration of wealth, and competition in the insane world of power politics. See, that's an interesting That's an interesting theory. Here we go again with these people asking these same copy-pasted question in my chat. I think I'm just going to have to ban. I don't understand what the idea is here. And their account subtitle is, I need 1,000 followers in order to go live. Follow me and I'll follow back. Yeah, that's a block. That's not quality content. All right. So he's saying Israel was the big, loosely formed group that worshipped Yahweh. The prophets came by and said, if you start to be political and try to have power and rule over people, you lose your blessing from God. You don't have a legitimate ground for even existing. God will destroy you. And so it wasn't really about social justice like modern people try to make it. The prophets were just concerned about social justice. It's more that the transition from a religious community to a political power structure had eroded away the old religious ethics in favor of being like all the rest of the nations. And that's in quotation marks, being like all the rest of the nations. Certainly that's what prophets actually did talk about. And so these prophets came by to warn them that they were changing the simplicity of what God instituted at the covenant with Sinai into something that is pagan like all the other nations. And so that makes an argument that it was supposed to be originally just a simple community of tribes that would have God, quote unquote, God ruling over them, although he doesn't seem to actually acknowledge the idea of God being real here. It's just whether it's real or not, this is what they believed. And I think he's trying to be very a rational scholar here, although he himself was a Christian preacher, so I would hope he actually personally believed in God. He's not going to make that argument because this isn't supposed to be a religious text. This is supposed to be a scholarly work based on history, and so he's trying to find this weird balance, right? He says, the radical difference between persons and political power structures is just as basic to biblical thought as it has been throughout history. The biblical revolution was a marvelously creative answer to the old dilemma of loyalty to the small primary community versus loyalty to the large community necessary to a rising population with its more complex economic and political problems. It survived long enough to prove that it could function effectively, but it seems to have become dominant only after a major catastrophe, the Babylonian exile and the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Well, I guess he's lumping those almost together, but those are two different periods, I guess, where he says that it became dominant after they were destroyed. He says, one would think that a major social catastrophe ought not to be necessary to emphasize the fact that persons and their well-being should take precedence over abstract political structures and social organizations. The political structure exists for the well-being of those who live under its control, not the opposite. In summary, then, early Israel was the dominion of Yahweh, consisting of all those diverse lineages, clans, individuals, and other social segments that, under the covenant, had accepted the rule of Yahweh and simultaneously had rejected the domination of various local kings with their tutelary deities, the Baalim, I guess plural of Baal, as a necessary corollary. He's just using academic language, fancy language for no reason here. Yahweh was the one who exclusively exercised the classic functions of the king, as described in the prologue of the Code of Hammurabi. You guys might know that. People have talked about that on TikTok, the Code of Hammurabi, the idea that the Ten Commandments were just a ripoff of the Code of Hammurabi. That's a big popular idea right now. I've seen it circulating. And in other early codes as well. In the earlier code of Lipit Ishtar, we read, Lipit Ishtar, the wise shepherd, whose name has been pronounced by Nunnemnir, to the princeship of the land in order to establish justice in the land, to banish complaints, to turn back enmity and rebellion by the force of arms, and to bring well-being to the Sumerians and Akkadians. The Sumerians and the Akkadians are the two predecessors of Babylon, I believe. Neo-Babylon, that is to say, not the Tower of Babel. Anyway. The administration of law internally, the waging of war, and the economic well-being of diverse populations are here already the three prime functions of the king, and they correspond to the functions of a state as a monopoly of force. Okay, so he's arguing that what Israel did was not actually that special. The idea that God was going to rule over them and, do these different things, that was easy to steal from the surrounding Mesopotamian beliefs, except theirs was going to be different for various reasons. They took the general idea from these other places. He says in early Israel, all these functions were directly attributed to Yahweh, whose function as a leader in war has frequently been an embarrassment to a liberal theology unaware of the historical context of the whole ideology. The creation of a state of war could legitimately come about only through Yahweh himself, but the declaration was released, so to speak, through a spokesman, prophets, or prophetess in the case of Deborah, or men of God, or the assembly of the representatives of the tribes. The second function of Yahweh as judge and lawgiver receives much greater emphasis, though, as in any other kingship, the daily routine of court cases was delegated to and operated through the village courts, but was thoroughly subjected to the royal policy of God, who remained the final court of appeal. And then he has a quote from the Bible, I believe. He will cry out to me, and I will hear, for I am compassionate. That's a quote from Exodus 22:27. He says, in biblical faith, this certainty is an important origin, if not the origin, of prayer. Okay, so he's saying that prayer came out of the idea that God would be the final court of appeal in this system. This is interesting. I mean, it's clearly he's, deconstructing the text and reworking it and having his own interpretation, but, there is a basis for thinking that some of this stuff is valid. And that doesn't mean it's the best way of framing it. It just means it's interesting. God loves his confusion with this guy. I can't. I'm sorry, but I like to learn different points of view. I think the enemies always try to push different doctrines. Discernment is a must. Yes. Shadowrate says, I like that he's stating that only God was allowed to declare war. That's valid. Yeah, a lot of the things he says sounds kind of offensive, but it's not really when you actually look at the text, because the text includes a bunch of history of Israelites not listening to God. And so if you actually just took the things that God instituted, it would look very different from the history of the Jews, because they kept disobeying God. And so if you want to reconstruct the history of the Jewish kingdom and people and the Israelites, you basically have to separate all of the stuff that they did wrong from what they were supposed to do originally. And of course, we know from the New Testament that Jesus and Paul and all of them criticized even the forefathers of Israel as not being obedient to God. And so how wrong is it to go back and say they messed everything up early on and, they did all these ideas that God didn't like? Of course, this guy is not even saying that God is real, but he's arguing that the appeal to God and the idea of God doing these things, not only was it common in other cultures, which I do believe, I mean, it's not like the God of Israel was unique. Clearly, what was it, Isaac? When he was riding around, his wife had an idol from another god, and there was this whole thing where she stole the god from her father, and she hid it under her seat, and like all these types of things. So clearly there's idolatry and other gods in the early stories of the Bible. Unworthy Servant says the whole argument of descriptive versus prescriptive text. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Bible is a bunch of stories that include instructions, but then you can immediately see that they don't actually follow those instructions. And so people go and they try to say, oh, I guess they were following those instructions because, look, it tells their story. But actually, it's a very self-critical story. And one of the arguments, I think, with the Deuteronomic history that we were looking up is that somebody came by later who was not just writing propaganda, but actually the reason why, for example, like the Deuteronomic history is to say somebody came by in Babylon, in the Babylonian exile, and said, why did we get punished by God? And then they went and wrote the history from Deuteronomy to Second Chronicles or whatever, or Second Kings, of all these judges and Samuel and David and Solomon and all these things. And they wrote that to explain why they were now being punished by God. So it's not propaganda to say we did everything right, we've never done anything wrong. It's a study of saying God has cursed us because we didn't obey his covenant, right? And so they're not trying to dismiss the Bible, but they are breaking away from the text being a literal history in a lot of ways. So it's controversial, and it's hard. It's not a fundamentalist point of view, where a fundamentalist says, this text came from God. It was just inspired by the Holy Spirit, and there was no agenda behind it. This is just written as truth, and it's a factual, totally accurate account of how everything happened. That's the fundamentalist point of view. This is a historic point of view that tries to reconstruct it using people groups and languages and looking at all the different seeming contradictions and missing time periods and gaps and all these things and say, how do we actually explain this using logic as opposed to just saying, that's how God wrote it, So normally I don't even think that way, but because I'm writing this book, I want to at least understand that point of view. Okay, how much longer are we going to go? I think I got another 15 or 20 minutes. Unworthy Servant says the author gives too much credit to men, does not explain the supernatural prophecies fulfilled. Well, certainly I wrote a book on biblical prophecy being fulfilled, and it includes the book of Daniel and Old Testament prophecies, Isaiah. And so, yes, my book will reinforce that the Bible was inspired by God. It's just, if this guy has a bunch of valid points, first of all, I actually literally started writing a paragraph that George Mendenhall came up with this theory that Moses lied to the people at Sinai and he made up all this stuff. And I was just going to start blasting George Mendenhall and saying he did all this stuff, and he's basically destroying the Bible's credibility, and he doesn't even believe God exists and all this stuff. And then my conscience felt bad about it because I didn't actually confirm those things. I just got that impression from reading a simplified version of his theory that somebody wrote. And then I read an essay of his, and I'm like, okay, he's actually bringing up a lot of good points. Like this idea that the law, the covenant that God made with Israel never changed, and that it was never taken away from or added to, and that, you know, God wanted there to be a king and wanted there to be, you know, these different things, that he's actually correct in criticizing a bunch of the misconceptions. And so I wanted to know, where exactly does he start to blaspheme and say things that I could criticize him for? And so, first of all, you have to read it, and then you have to, I guess, because there's not a lot of online resources talking about this guy's views, but he's influential, apparently. Patronizing Saint says, discernment is vital, and not everyone gets that. It is. And discernment can come in different forms. I mean, I learn things here sometimes that is like, oh, I didn't know about that. So now I'm reworking my own theory of how this all fits together. Just like when I read Michael Heiser's stuff, I don't just take Michael Heiser at face value and say he's an expert, therefore he knows everything. I've actually seen Michael Heiser distort verses and get things wrong accidentally. Things that I've studied that he apparently hasn't studied enough, and he gets something wrong. And I'm like, okay, so he's just a guy. He can make mistakes. I can make mistakes. Nobody has the full story. Nobody has the complete truth. So that's why we talk about these things and we debate these things. Here's a footnote here that I'm actually interested in reading. He says, in that point he mentioned earlier where he says the concept of ethnic unity was thoroughly rejected and challenged by the reform movement we now call Christianity. He has a footnote that says, Romans 10 verse 12, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and bestows his riches upon all who call upon him. Also see Galatians 3:28. The ethnic and cultural differences are just as irrelevant to the rule of God as are those of legal status under the pagan secular law, or of sex. This is nothing new. Isaiah 49 verse 6 and many other passages emphasized as strongly as possible that the salvation and teaching of Yahweh should extend to all nations. And then he references Matthew 12:50 and Luke 13:29, which are callbacks to Isaiah 49 verse 6. Unworthy Servant says, if you ever write a book disproving Michael Heiser, I guess, I'd be the first to order. You don't like Michael Heiser? I enjoyed his Unseen Realm book. I haven't heard a strong counter-argument against him, but I just, when I'm reading it or when I was listening to it, I'm like, okay, he seems to be giving a lot of credit to other ancient cultures and not a lot to Israel. Like, for some reason, just because it's not biblical, it somehow has more weight than the Bible. It's like the Bible has to be the one that's the most wrong. Everything else, every other culture gets to be there first and have more authority, and then the Bible is always just reacting to other cultures, other ancient cultures. I don't see how that makes sense either. That doesn't seem rational either. Okay, we can read a little bit more here. Where's the end of the chapter? Okay, there's one more page, and then there's the end of the chapter. So he was talking about how the idea of God ruling things is about the royal policy of God, who remained the final court of appeal. He will cry out to me, and I will hear, for I am compassionate. He says the third function of general economic welfare operated primarily through the curses and blessings formulas, which have to do largely with the natural world, but with the external pagan world as well, since economic well-being was hardly compatible with a state of constant warfare. All of these constant elements in human political society are thus subjected to ethical controls defined as the rule of God, and are given an ultimately metaphysical interpretation, given an ultimately ethical and therefore human and historical interpretation, as opposed to the metaphysical interpretations of ancient paganism. To reject the ethical control, or to accept other grounds for behavior and choices, such as the ethically neutral technical means of divination or necromancy, or even wisdom, in quotation marks, was to reject God himself, and was punishable by death in the early law code. The ethic had predictive value. In fact, the ethic consisted in large part of the ability of persons to predict the consequences of their behavior as they affected other persons and caused them to react. This is one of the foundations of pre-exilic prophecy, which enabled them to predict the course of history with uncanny accuracy. He says Exodus 22 verse 18 very probably has to do with necromancy. Speaking of the Witch of Endor narrative, or you see also the Witch of Endor narrative in 1 Samuel 28 verse 9. Should I look up these verses? I mean, I think I get what he's generally talking about, but I don't know if I should be looking up these verses if you guys are interested in that. By the way, thank you for the 5,000 likes here on TikTok. I know that this is a weird one. Thank you guys for tuning into it. Okay, Armored Wolf wants me to look this up. Let's look up Exodus 22 verse 18 and see if it has anything to do with necromancy. It says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." That's the verse. He says it very probably has to do with necromancy. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. And then 1 Samuel 28 verse 9. Says, "So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, 'Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you.' And the woman said to him, 'Surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death?' But Saul swore an oath to her by the Lord, 'As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing.' Then the woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' He said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? You are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Do not be afraid. What do you see?' And the woman said to Saul, 'I see a god coming up out of the earth.' And he said to her, 'What is his appearance?' And she said, 'An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe.' And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, 'Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. And Samuel said, Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? It's pretty solid logic. The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. That's ominous. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines. All right. Interesting. Interesting stuff. Patronizing Saint says the Bible is disregarded as historical at all by some. Yeah, some people don't even think it has historical value. Armored Wolf says, dang, harsh. Shadow Raid says, by implication, is that Samuel had died and the entity Saul talked with was a demon. How is that the implication? That's not what the text seems to imply. Unworthy Servant says, this kind of study helps you prepare for 1 Peter 3 situations. Shadow Raid says, so Saul assumed it was Samuel and then bowed to it to pay homage? Nice. Did it ever claim to be Samuel directly or claim to have come in the name of the Lord? I guess that's a good point. But didn't the thing that the demons say still come to pass if in that case? Unworthy Servant says, but the text seems to imply that God actually showed Saul to be called. Let's see what it says afterwards. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. So the Bible says it was the words of Samuel in verse 20. It doesn't say a spirit. It says Samuel. And it says, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and night. And the woman came to Saul, and when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now, therefore, you also obey your servant. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way. He refused and said, I will not eat. But his servants, together with the woman, urged him, and he listened to their words. So he rose and went away, and it doesn't seem like it follows up on the Samuel thing at all. And it also says, when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. It says in verse 14, and Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, so I guess you could argue that the Bible is not bothering to say that it was a false spirit, because from Saul's point of view, it was Samuel. But if that was a major point that you were supposed to understand, I think it would say, but it was not really Samuel. You know, it was a false spirit, and Saul thought that it was Samuel or something like that. But okay. Anyway, that's a good point, though. We still have one page left to read here. So he was talking about necromancy and the fact that people were not supposed to do those things. And so that's why it's wrong for Saul to be doing this, because it was forbidden by the early law. You had to just trust God and live ethically. You weren't allowed to take fate into your own hands and try to divine things and use sorcery. The ethic had predictive value. Okay, so we read that. Well, we should read this anyway because Now that we've read the thing about necromancy, it'll make more sense. The ethic had predictive value. In fact, the ethic consisted in large part of the ability of persons to predict the consequences of their behavior as they affected other persons and caused them to react. This is one of the foundations of pre-exile prophecy, which enabled them to predict the course of history with uncanny accuracy. The prophetic message is relatively simple. The rejection of those ethical controls that were identified with the rule of God constituted the rejection of God himself, and therefore the corporate existence brought about by that divine rule could no longer be legitimized by appeal to Yahweh. On the contrary, it must be destroyed as the enemy of Yahweh. But there is nothing in the prophetic message that would prescribe the death penalty for all persons. Rather, it is the social institutions of state and temple that must go, once they have ceased to be responsible either to Yahweh or to those in society who most need protection. So he's arguing that the curses that God gave do not necessitate the death of the Israelites and those who serve Yahweh, but rather the death of the institutions that fail to serve the people. As a corollary to this rule of God, if a military leader, judge, or even a farmer were blessed with success or outstanding achievement in his occupation, to claim glory or social prestige on such grounds would constitute an act of rebellion or treason. Joab recognized this principle at the siege of Rabbath Ammon, as well as he should have in view of the enormous hardship and danger he shared with David. Because of the empty-headed adulation of the successful military leader by the young women of the country. This principle of agency is essential to any functioning political structure, but it is operated in a fashion radically different from the age-old paganism in which the military leader is the great benefactor who is thereby entitled to the gratitude and obedience of the populace. The receipt of a benefit always places the recipient under obligation. But in the rule of God, no person whose activity resulted in benefit to others could claim their obligation to himself, simply because he himself was acting as an agent of a superior command. With the growth of practical atheism, however, nothing existed as superior of the military general, and the ancient story of man's subjection by man ended with the mad policy of Rehoboam. Politics has made little progress since, and the process of political revolution is usually based upon the blind devotion of masses in the hope of gaining wealth by following a leader who promises everything. Well, there's a political comment at the end of this chapter. Patronizing Saint says, were they musicians? That's why the girls chased them. Lol. Good one. Stapleton says, gotta go to meeting. Have a blessed weekend, y'all. Thanks, Terry. Well, we're at the end of the chapter, so you made it all the way to the end. Have a good day. Now, there are footnotes still we could look at. One is footnote 119 says, but there is nothing in the prophetic message that would prescribe the death penalty for all persons. And the footnote says, the remnant is a recurring theme from Amos to Jeremiah. So I guess God judges the evil people, but then there's a remnant that he spares, and he's saying that that is proof that it wasn't about destroying all of Israel, just the corrupt people. He says, to claim glory or social prestige on such grounds would constitute an act of rebellion or treason. And then he has a footnote saying, Gideon's words are an authentic expression of the old ideology from Judges 8:22 to 23. Let's look up Judges 8, 22 to 23. Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your sons, and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Gideon's a smart guy. Verse 24, and Gideon said to them, "Let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me earrings from his spoil." For they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, "We will willingly give them." And they spread a cloak, and every man threw the earrings in his spoil, threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod out of it and put it in his city in Ophrah. And all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. I guess Gideon isn't that smart after all. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. Okay. But he did say, "My people will not rule over you. I'm not going to rule over you. God will rule over you." Let's see. Joab recognized this principle at the siege of Rabbath Ammon. That is 2 Samuel 12. Verse 26 to 28. Now Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and took the royal city. And Joab sent messengers to David and said, "I have fought against Rabbah. Moreover, I have taken the city of waters. Now then, gather the rest of the people together and encamp against the city and take it, lest I take the city and it be called by my name." Interesting. So David gathered all the people together and went to Rabbah and fought against it and took it. And he took the crown of the king from his head. The weight was of a talent of gold, and in it was a precious stone, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it, and set them to labor with saws and iron picks and iron axes, and made them toil at the brick kilns. And thus he did to all the cities of the Ammonites. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem. All right. There you go. One more footnote, I think. Where is it? The receipt of benefit is always places the recipient under obligation, but in the rule of God, no person whose activity resulted in benefit to others could claim their obligation to himself simply because he himself was acting as an agent of a superior command. And the footnote is Luke 14:12 to 14, New Testament. He also said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or banquet," this is Jesus talking, "when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return to be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Man, we have to read the Gospel of Luke sometime. The Gospel of Luke is so fascinating. I actually missed one more footnote. Oh, yeah, Patronizing Saint, you'll enjoy this. David because of the empty-headed adulation of the successful military leader by the young women of the country. Footnote 122, it says 1 Samuel 18, 7-8. Which is, and the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have... Oh, empty-headed. It was a thrash metal band. But just listen to this. This is documented for all history. You know, Saul was very angry at the fact that these women were singing about David. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Oh my goodness. He says, the same is true of the prophet. Though modern thought regards it as incredible presumption to present a message as the authentic word of the Lord, as do the prophets, ancient thought regarded as even more arrogant and presumptuous to present such messages as the prophet's own idea. This is well recognized in the New Testament period. Quote, he who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. John 7:18. Yeah, I guess when it comes to prophecy especially. Okay. Well, that's the end of the chapter. You guys got a little taste of the kind of thing that I'm looking into today. Yeah, Saul was definitely envious. Debbie says, how do you apply that in today's life? How do I apply it? Oh. Well, I guess there's too many things to apply any one given thing, but for my sake, I'm getting a better sense of what George Mendenhall and his theory actually try to do when they're drawing these lines between certain differences between how the Bible is actually written versus what he thinks historically makes the most sense. And I don't know. I'll have to think about it in my own free time, because that's what I do. You know, I read a bunch of stuff that I don't necessarily agree with, and then I digest it, you know, over time. So it's not that there's an immediate message that I take away from it when it's this kind of stuff. When I'm reading the Bible, I usually try to have a more direct meaning that I take from it right away. But when it's just somebody else's writings and scholarship, I read it so that I can understand their point of view, and then at some point as I'm reading, I usually catch up with what they're saying, and then from that point I can sort of get ahead of them and anticipate what they're going to say next and understand their theory, whereas right now I feel like I'm still not really caught up on what Mendenhall is trying to say, and so I'm trying to just catch up with his line of thinking, and that's fun for me, and I'm a nerd, so that's what I do. For what it's worth, chapter 2 is called The Mask of Yahweh. So I guess he's going to get into the idea of whether God exists or whether it's just a mask or something. I don't know. I'm going to guess it gets more controversial as we go along. Not that I'm going to read this again on the stream, but today I really wanted to finish that chapter, and I figured I may as well do it on stream here. Guys, if we can get to 10,000 likes on YouTube, that would be cool. It's already 8:30, but I could take one or two questions if you want to. Patronizing Saint says, makes me think of Nietzsche's book, The Antichrist. Okay. What does he say? Because I hate Nietzsche, but I haven't actually read his book, The Antichrist. Oh, that's where he writes about will to power. I'm a little bit familiar with that. It's all about justifying your own desires instead of trying to appeal to morality. I don't see how that relates to what Mendenhall is saying, though. Are you saying that Mendenhall is criticizing the idea of will to power and saying that the true religion that was established with Moses was about ethics and caring about morality, not just having a will to power, and that got corrupted over time by the Israelite rulers? Unworthy servant says there, 10,000. Thank you. We did it. We did it, boys. That's what it was all about, is getting those sweet 10,000 likes. That's why we're here. No, I'm just kidding. But it is nice to see the support. Thank you very much. If you guys have not checked out my Linktree, you might want to go check out my Substack and subscribe there. You might want to check out my YouTube channel where you can watch all of these studies back and get caught up on things. And Patronizing Saint says he was very pompous. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. He writes in little snippets. I had to read it and actually thought it was pretty cool, but I had to explain to my grandmother. No, not that it relates, but that when you're talking about reading about things that are against Christianity, it made me think of that. Oh, yes. Yeah. I read all sorts of stuff that's not Christian, and to try to fill in the blanks of, like, how did we get to where we are? What kind of influence did this have on modern thinking and all this kind of stuff? And then you just have to be able to sort out and all that stuff. That's the job of a nerd. Shadow Raid says, would it be reasonable to posit a privileged Prince of Egypt would create the best moral code ever? Or that his moral code came from a source beyond man since it's contrary to man? Or that this moral code came from a source beyond man since it's contrary to man? I've heard that argument that the Bible is so contrary to our instincts that it must be divine, because a normal person wouldn't write such things. And I think that's actually true in a lot of ways. But I do want to give credit where credit is due to what this guy's saying, which is his argument. And I didn't read the first whole, part of the book, so you just kind of caught this tail end of this chapter. One of the things he argues is that the Bible was born, and the Sinai covenant was born out of a disgust, a hatred that was a hatred of paganism and Egyptian code and the chaos and petty kings and dictatorships and human rulers and that Moses / God, I suppose, had this new idea of let's not have any human ruler. And it wasn't so much that it had to come from God because it's so revolutionary, as much as he would say it was an amazing idea wherever it came from, but that it was logical because of the fact that these people came out of an oppressive empire. And so they basically took a lot of the things around them and said, what if we did the good things that they say, but that instead of having a human be in charge of all of it, we put God in charge of it, and then nobody's allowed to be in charge of it because God is in charge of it. And then basically the fact that it didn't work because it got corrupted would be sort of the explanation for the counter explanation for if God really gave it, why did it not work? And so it's actually less offensive to a guy like Mendenhall because if it came from God, it should be very stable. And instead you have this constant waywardness and stuff like that. And so I agree with you. And I don't even know if he's going to fully argue that it was just a hoax and it was not a real revelation from God, and that there was no. So far, it sounds like he's building a completely secular version of the Bible, right? That just has mythology worked into it. But yeah, I mean, I fully believe that the prophecies, right from the Garden of Eden to Isaiah to Daniel to Revelation, are real. I wrote a book on Revelation, and I think it's amazingly, accurate and profound and underappreciated. And so the balance is weird, though, for me, because what I'm doing as I'm writing this book, and every time I write a book, including my one on Revelation, what I do is I basically say, I don't want to just write a book that just confirms what I already believe and ignore all the opposite evidence. I want to reopen the issue and examine it from the ground up and see what the different points of view are and where they fall short and what a better explanation is, so that I myself can learn and try to create the most solid view of it that I can. And that's what I'm doing now with essentially the Old Testament. Although that's not initially why I started writing the book, that is essentially what I'm going to have to end up doing. And so that's why I'm interested in Luke from Voice of Reasons. I was asking him if he would be willing to contribute, maybe not an actual written part, since I understand he doesn't want to write, but at some point I'll have to talk to him. I'm interested in your thoughts too, Dan. These different points of view on it, how to defend the Old Testament, even in light of something as strong as Mendenhall and these other scholars coming by and saying that there's this whole other more rational explanation. I'm even willing to like, we were reading that Ellicott, right? That Ellicott commentary of the Bible had these different arguments for why certain documents would have been written at different points. The prophets and the judges and these different people would have written different things, and then they later got combined into Genesis and Exodus and these books that we later have. And so far, I'm totally leaning the way of Ellicott. I think his explanation sounds the best. But Mendenhall has this whole other theory that there was a bunch of fake stories worked into the Old Testament to try to reconcile all these different tribes who didn't actually belong together. And so Genesis is basically a fake story to get you to the point of the Egyptian captivity. And then from there, that's when the real story starts, or whatever. And that they really only become a singular tribe with Joshua and all this kind of stuff. So anyway. Jay Thompson says we need to look at other points of view in order to calibrate our own moral compass. I'm going to stop short of saying moral compass. For me, this is an intellectual reassessment. I was raised to believe that the Bible basically came down, whole cloth from the sky, as a perfect document that humans didn't even really, influence it. It was written by God. It is God's word. Everything in it is a perfect record, and it is divine. And if there's anything you don't understand, it's just because God made it too difficult for you to understand, and it's written for us today. It's not written for an ancient people that we are now reading their thoughts and their traditions and trying to figure out and piece together their stuff. I had a very fundamentalist point of view growing up, and that served me well for a lot of time. But I don't want to just cling to that forever. I want to look at, for example, we've been reading 1 Corinthians, and I plan on next week going back and reading more 1 Corinthians. We've seen Paul himself saying, God does not give me a commandment here. I am going to give you my own advice. And so Paul is clearly actually saying on the page that the Holy Spirit and God is not giving him a direct thing to write, but he's still writing, and it's in the Bible. So how does that make sense if everything in the Bible is 100% just the words of God coming through the person and through their pen, and they're just writing it verbatim? There are things in the Bible that are a person's opinion, the author's opinion, and there are mistakes in the Bible that don't quite square, small inaccuracies, and there's even parts where the Bible will give an estimate of things. So it says, there was 10 to 20 whatever feet of water above the mountains or something like that in the flood. I don't know the example per se, but there's different parts where there's an estimate, a range of numbers. Well, if God was going to give you a perfect 100% download of accurate information, there wouldn't need to be an estimate. You would have the perfect count of exactly how many everything was, right? And so there's different things like that that tell you that a person was involved in trying to figure this out. And so you asked the exact correct question, Shadow Raid, and compound that with predestination. Where does that leave us? That is exactly the question of my book that I'm writing. I have a whole section I'm going to write about predestination and how it ties in with the difficulties of the Bible. So you're completely on the same page as I am in asking that question. And I don't want to dodge the question. That's the thing. With this book, I do not want to dodge the issue. I want to take it on, and I want to try to come up with something satisfying. And so Unworthy Servant says, good example, 400 years in Egypt and 430 in another verse. Yeah, I think, and then there's, the genealogy of Jesus and the different Gospels, which both try to trace Joseph's genealogy, but they have different lines, and people say, oh, well, they have explanations for that. And there's a lot of good-intentioned Christians making answers for why things don't seem to be perfect in the Bible. And then there's other guys who say because there's any flaws at all, the whole thing is a big hoax and a scam, and it's all a lie and it's BS and we don't have to listen to it. I don't like either of those positions, that it's 100% flawless in everything that it says and no human was involved in trying to, remember something and maybe they forgot something or whatever, or it's all a big lie and it's a hoax and it's just a religious attempt to enslave mankind and whatever. I want to figure out a good balance and incorporate, like Shadowraid said, things like predestination and prophecy, that I do believe in prophecy. I do believe that God gives specific prophecies that actually do really come to pass, and they are real predictions of what's going to happen. And so there's so much baggage from tradition, and basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to get away from the tradition and understand the core reality. And as part of that, I have to basically I can take a shortcut by looking at what experts in all these different things have said and find where they are saying something wrong, and then use them against each other to sort of cancel each other out, and then see what we're left with and all this kind of stuff. And it's a good challenge for me. Okay. Looks like God, Love, and Patronizing Saint are having a conversation. All right. Patronizing Saint says, I would also love to hear your input on Dante's Inferno, because I've always wanted to discuss whether there are actual biblical concepts in that, but I don't know enough about it. Dante supposedly wrote about that stuff is actually from the Bible, but it's a weird account that's really kind of fascinating to me, but I never knew if any of it checks out with the Bible. I have read Dante's Inferno a long time ago, I think when I was a teenager, and there's a lot of non-biblical stuff in there. I think it's basically Catholic ideology. I think the Catholics came up with a lot of that stuff, but I would have to double check. All right. Shadow Raid says, I've studied Matthew 1 and Luke 3 genealogy discrepancy before. It's a neat dive. Unworthy Servant says, I think choosing Matthias to replace Judas was their wisdom. I think that was supposed to be Paul. Yeah, and we never hear about Matthias again. Yeah, so exactly. There are examples, and this is the thing, like there's this idea that if one thing in the Bible gives way, it's like a house of cards. It's all going to collapse, right? There's this fear that if you could find one fault with the Bible, since it's God's word, that means God is a liar. It means that the Bible's not true, and the whole thing is just a big bunch of smoke and mirrors and lies, and because, we found one thing that was wrong. That, of course, I get into the whole idea of, were these manuscripts actually preserved perfectly? Were they translated perfectly? Where does the fault even come? Were they originally perfect, but then somewhere along the line, somebody else screwed it up? Does that make a difference? Does God have to perfectly preserve the text all the way from the original version to today in order for it to be a holy text? Could there have been a corruption of some things somewhere along the line? And all these types of questions I'm going to be writing about. So, Patronizing Saint says, you're going to have to return to predestination sometime. I can't wrap my head around it. Even after that whole thing I read, Patronizing Saint says, agree, Terry. When it comes to being free from human interpretation, I have always thought that that wasn't true. I mean, we have the King James version. There are versions. Yeah. So that is a snapshot of one of the things I'm studying right now. Thank you very much for showing interest in it, because I never know. This is a very nerdy thing. But talking out loud about it and discussing it actually helps me understand it. And so you guys help me out as well. Patronizing Sense says, so I always thought there was human interpretation that would have had to be present because it doesn't refuse ink when you print different versions. Yeah. That's just the English translation. I mean, you're not even going into the ancient manuscripts and the copies of the copies of the copies that we have that survived and all these things. Bailey says, I think you could argue that it is perfect in its imperfection. Yeah. Guys, this is the kind of stuff that, I'm up to my eyeballs in this type of logic that I am arguing in my book, and doing the research as part of that so that I don't mischaracterize other people's arguments is definitely what I'm interested in. But it sounds like there's interest in the same topic from other people, and Shadow Raid says, it's possible God will allow the text to be tampered with to exemplify his own glory. God is like, I could force it to remain flawless, but what would that prove? Unworthy servant says, I believe the autographs were 100% inspired. Autographs are the original thing that was originally written. Guys, this is good stuff. This is exactly the kind of stuff we can speculate on it. We can have our own opinions on it. In the end, I will say this, in defense of George Mendenhall's approach, his introduction to this book sounds so much like the intro to my book, Maybe Everyone is Wrong, because he says, this is my hypothesis. I'm going to argue for it. I'm going to put the arguments forward. Basically, I'm not saying this is the truth, but if I'm gonna go and try to reconstruct all this stuff and do this whole theory, I'm going to just put my hypothesis forward and defend it. And so I respect his approach there, because he's saying it's a hypothesis, right? And when you do that, what am I going to say? He's not claiming it's dogma. He's not claiming it's sacred truth. I can disagree with his methods. I can disagree with his conclusions, but I respect that level of humility to say it's just a hypothesis. And I feel the same way. I'm going to be saying the same thing, of course, in my book, that this is my hypothesis. This is as close as I can get right now to what makes sense. And so that's one of the things. We're having fun on YouTube over here, guys. If you don't check out YouTube, you can check it out sometime. We got a whole other conversation going on there. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Actually, that's it for this week. I'll be back Monday, if God is willing. As the Bible taught us, we should say, if we live and God is willing, let us do such and such. So, thank you for tuning in. Next week, I'm planning on doing more 1 Corinthians, so we can finish off the book of 1 Corinthians and then go from there. Thank you.